Here we are. How do we get to this part of the day, everyone? And thanks for hanging in there with us. So this is the Victim, Survivor and Frontline Workers panel. And there's many, many incredible voices sat beside me right now, so really, really excited about this. I'm going to try and be brief based on the fact that we've got quite a short amount of time, but I was going to quickly read some bios. So with us today, we've got Jayke Burgess, a victim survivor. Jayke Burgess is a married trans queer man who experienced domestic violence for many years, mostly while he presented as a female. Jayke has degrees in sociology and ethics and teaches university social work with a focus on domestic violence. Jayke manages mental health and welfare programs across Sydney and works in consultation with organisations, including Domestic Violence New South Wales, I should add, to ensure that lived experience and lived expertise are forming many, many aspects of services and responses. Jayke is also a person known with a neurological disease and intimately understands the challenges faced by those marginalised and the intersectional barriers to accessing support. So welcome, Jayke, and thank you so much for being here today. Amanda Morgan, victim survivor. Amanda is a Yota Yota woman living in Durrock country. Amanda is a trauma and domestic violence informed survivor advocate, activist, speaker and writer, and again has been a big part of Domestic Violence New South Wales events, really engaging, so thank you, Amanda, for being here today as well. Amanda is the founder of A Maker's Seat Australia and 2022 Churchill Fellow, as you mentioned earlier, who will travel to the United States, Canada, England and Scotland and New Zealand this year to investigate trauma-informed approaches to legal processes for historically underserved survivors, which is going to be so interesting. We can't wait to hear more about that. Amanda is an advisor to the strategy group for the National Plan to Prevent and Respond to Child Sexual Abuse and the National Safety Women's Alliance and a director at March for Justice. And as we know, Amanda's studying quite a bit at the moment as well and has completed a Bachelor for Psychology and a Bachelor of Law at the Macquarie University. Welcome, Amanda. Next. See, they're very, very significant bios and they can't be missed really. So Ulla Inki-Gilabert from No to Violence. Ulla is currently the Sector Development Manager at No to Violence for New South Wales Sector Development, consisting of practice development, advocacy and sector coordination in men's family violence interventions. Prior to working at No to Violence, Ulla spent many years working in the domestic and family violence sector, both overseas and in Australia, including as a manager at the Domestic Violence Specialist Service, overseeing men's behaviour change programs and facilitating programs. Welcome, Ulla. Nemat Kharboutli, welcome, Muslim Women Australia. So Nemat is the Linking Heart Service Manager at Muslim Women Australia, which is a representative body for Muslim women across working to enrich humanity, advocacy for equality and the rights for all women. Muslim Women Australia was established in 1983. Nemat works collaboratively across the women's sector to advocate for sexual, domestic and family violence to ensure that we have a free and inclusive Australia. Her key areas of interest are the gendered nature of violence and Islamophobia. As part of her work at Muslim Women Australia, Nemat hopes to contribute to policy reform that enhances culturally, linguistically and religiously appropriate service provision to facilitate women's agency and greater access of support to women. I should also add Nemat's a staunch board member at Domestic Violence New South Wales, a huge advocate in the space. Nemat has a Bachelor of Social Science, Criminology and Social Policy from the University of New South Wales and is a passionate social justice, social inclusion, diversity policy and on women's issues. So two more important bios. So Tanya Whitehouse, welcome. Tanya Whitehouse, OAM, has worked at MacArthur Women's Domestic Violence Court Advocacy Service for 30 years, supporting and walking alongside victim survivors of domestic and family violence. She has been on multiple committees and consultations, acknowledging the importance of collaboration and consultation. In 2020, Tanya received an OAM for her service in the community. Her focus and passion is on the voice of women, especially those who haven't found their voices yet. Her goal is to empower women so they feel safe with their children and challenge the inequities that come with complexities of domestic violence. Her mantra is, underestimate me, that will be fun, and don't we know it? So, certainly last but not least in the awesome suit, Jade. Jade Parker from ACON. Jade is the Community Health Promotion Officer in Sexual, Domestic and Family Violence at ACON, an LGBTQIA+ and health organisation. Jade graduated with first-class honours in criminology. Their thesis spoke to the context of specific barriers to helping seek for LGBTQIA+ survivors and sexual, domestic and family violence regionally. Welcome, Jade, and welcome, panel. What a panel. So my first question is going to be to Nemat, actually, and I think this has been coming up quite a lot in a lot of media that Domestic Violence New South Wales has had around marginalisation and barriers for migrant and refugee women. So Nemat, what are some of the complexities experienced by women from migrant and refugee backgrounds when it comes to being misidentified?
Thanks, Delia. Hi, everyone. Stay with us. We're almost there in the afternoon. Thanks for the question. I guess there's a few key points I want to make, and I am going to be conscious of time and give everybody a chance to speak as well, so I'll just try and get to the main points. First of all, Muslim Women Australia has been providing frontline domestic and family violence services to multicultural and multi-faith communities for over 35 years. So I stand on the shoulders of many of those who come before me. So I've been in the sector for over 10 years, and MWA has been, part of the women's refuge movement in that space for almost 40 years this year. So this is very much a professional knowledge and experience. I guess the good part about speaking at the end of the day is that there's been so much that has already been drawn on before by the expertise in the room. So I wanted just to contextualise that multicultural women's experiences is rooted in a lot of the issues that we spoke about today. It's rooted in the dynamics of domestic and family violence, in their experiences of trauma, in how it intersects with post-separation abuse, how it intersects with extended family-based abuse, how it intersects with migration, language barriers, cultural and racial discrimination in Muslim women's issues, in the context of the war on terror and Islamophobia and the way that that's played out. And it has a real impact practically on systems abuse and the way that that plays out in their lives. So for Muslim women and for multicultural women specifically, and women that we support, you see the harm that it does to them, and the touch point with the criminal justice system being re-traumatic. You see it when, in a really practical sense, when they are distraught and police attend and they're not believed and English is not their first language, and so it's easier and quicker and much more administrative to get the facts from someone who's a lot more calm and is a lot more fluent. And we see that play out in many ways. We also see the way that children are weaponised against their mothers in this space. It's really, really distressing, and especially more and more frequently the way that technology-facilitated abuse interacts with that as well. So from my perspective, what I wanted to really share was the role of specialisation in terms of healing and recovery, and what that means practically and resource-driven wise, in terms of it requires a much more longer-term case management approach. It's not time limited. It can go on for years. It's much more complicated. The engagement with different service systems when there are cross applications is much more difficult. Access to safe rooms when she's also got a record is much more difficult. Access to private lawyers, family lawyers. I've got cases in mind that pop out so strongly where the criminal matter's been dissolved, but the family law matter continues, and this is nothing new to what we've spoken about before. But the intersection of gender bias with racial bias, with language barriers, with migration-related abuse, it's scary. So my biggest concern is around the role of specialisation, around looking at universal access to human rights and accessibility, especially for women on temporary visas, seeing the multicultural women that we support who are much more educated as well, not getting they're on the other side of the spectrum, where we've got real extremes in the clients that we support in the misidentification around those who have such limited access to justice and those who are the non-offending parent and are being chased through the courts as well, and what that looks like for them. So I guess I just wanted to wrap up by really saying there needs to be a specialised, nuanced lens about culture, language and faith and how it manifests, because there are processes well beyond the criminal justice system in terms of community-based processes and what safety looks like there, what does resistance look like in that space. And we're just very, very narrow in the way that we think about how can we build in diversionary programs, how can we build in pathways to referral and rectification that includes women and that all women that aren't left further and further behind, because it's scary to go to a police station, it's scary to access support, and that doesn't mean we can't do it. I really, really believe we can. I really think it sounds really complicated when in great detail, but if we simplify and say, you know, how do we reduce harm, how do we make sure it actually works for people who need support, and how do we make sure that them seeking safety does not put them in a much more detrimental position moving forward.
Thank you, Nemat. And I think the specialisation piece is just so key there, and the gender-based violence piece that I think someone asked the police about, which I thought was fantastic. And I think you might have just come up with a bit of a call to action there, which we'll come back to as I wrap up. So Jade, coming to you, can you tell us a bit about your story of misidentification by the police and the family court, and how you feel misconceptions about your intersection as a proud trans man affected your experience? Thank you, Jayke.
Sure. I think I thought about this a lot. There's so many examples. It's like, which one do you choose? And I'll use the family court. When I went to family court, I went through family court for 4 years. I'm going through it again now. Up until the point of reaching a single expert, I met with the family report people and some other person. I lost count of the amount of people, and they all saw the domestic violence. So up until that point, it was fantastic. It was a fantastic experience. And then I met the single expert, and she called me she, and I looked like this. She called me she throughout the entire appointment. And I said to her, could you please call me she? And she said, well, that's the way you were born. And I knew I was in trouble before I even got the report. And when we got the report, my lawyer sat on the phone with me and she cried and we went, we got no chance here, because she's undone all the work we've done over the last 4 years. And I lost custody of my kids. And they're now in domestic violence, you know. They're adults, but 17-year-old adults. So that's a kind of really obvious example. But those examples happen all the time. And that narrative that was used on me by my perpetrator was also really important, which was that men can't be victims. And I'm really conscious of not talking about the fact that my perpetrator was a woman, but in my case it was. And in my longitudinal experience, my stepdaughter is now a perpetrator. And that's because my husband's ex-husband was a perpetrator. It's very complicated. And now we're raising our grandchildren, who are children, 14 and 3, and the 14-year-old's now a perpetrator. And we're trying to undo that. And it's the system's not identifying at each step of the way that there was a risk, not believing us. I think one of the things for a trans person is there's an implicit bias that happens. Lots of people say, and you see it in the media, trans people are lying about who they are. Trans people are hiding something. And the word that my single expert in family court used was that I spoke in hyperbole. And that's actually not my personality at all. Anyone who knows me will know I'm actually a really shy person, but I choose to do this because I want to make change. I don't go out of my way to express myself. I'm not an emotional person. So she described an entirely different person. But it was because of her own implicit bias that trans people were hiding something that I missed out on the opportunity to be heard and to be believed by that system.
Thank you so much for sharing your story. And I think the misconceptions and the bias, I mean, that's come up so much today, and that just absolutely has to be addressed through the education that we're doing and that meaningful work. And I think, again, being careful around what training looks like and making sure it's more than. Thank you so much, Jayke. So, Amanda, can you tell us about the tension between... Did someone pass me? Oh, no, sorry, I thought I saw a mic coming my way. So, Amanda, thank you. Can you tell us about the tension between being a victim and a perpetrator all at the same time, and the overshadowing of one of the other, and how that kind of impacted?
Yeah, thank you, Delia. I do want to start by acknowledging that we are meeting on the unceded lands of the Gadigal people. I am a proud Yorta Yorta woman, and I acknowledge our Indigenous kid in the audience as well. So I'm just going to talk straight to my lived experience. As a 10-year-old, my younger sibling and I were living with an elder sibling who has mental illness, really severe schizophrenia. And we were coming home from school one day, and we come around the corner and there's 5 police patrol cars parked around the front of our house. The police officers are standing behind their open car doors, pointing their pistols at my brother, who is standing on the veranda holding a hockey stick, clearly experiencing psychosis. And instead of acknowledging that he is traumatised and he needs medical assistance, they proceeded to just stand there as he willed them to shoot him. And they did. They were holding their pistols up at him, and he wasn't, coming towards them. He was static, standing still. But when my brother and I came onto the scene, they yelled at us. They screamed at my brother and I, get in the house, screamed it though. We were terrified. And so we actually had to run through the middle of the scene. They didn't put their weapons down. They didn't come to our aid. They told us to run into the house, so essentially putting us in danger by running through them to get past our elder brother into the home. And I guess the reason why, it's personal and it's awful, and I wanted to talk about it today, is because so often Indigenous survivors are identified as aggressors when actually they need, it's nuanced. There's a lot of nuance and there's a lot of layers and a lot of trauma. And what we need is assistance, and we need to be seen as survivors before we're seen as perpetrators. Whether he's a perpetrator or not, I'm not sure why they were called to the house, but too often we blanketly want to put people in one of 2 categories. There's no grey. It's easier to put someone in a moralised decision-making category: yes, no, right, wrong, black and white. And that's just not fair. Those police they weren't concerned about my little brother and I. They were concerned about the situation and an arrest. Very goal-driven, not trauma-informed at all, and essentially putting more children in danger as well. So, I just really wanted to speak to the nuance of mental health and the fact that he deserved better. My little brother and I deserved better. And a perpetrator doesn't just become a perpetrator of any kind of violence overnight. We don't live in vacuums or silos. More often than not, a perpetrator has... they don't take their survivor hat off to become a perpetrator. I just wanted to sort of bring people's attention to that.
And I think the nuances are really important, and I think you're speaking about having a humanistic, trauma-informed response, and today we've spoken about coercive control legislation, and there's this kind of tick box legislation, it's policy, but as a sector I think we're all quite scared about, actually there's a journey we're going to need to go on here, and it's that prevention work, and it's understanding we're human beings, and we've got to really think about how we respond. So thank you so much for sharing that personal story, Amanda. And I think there's much more of a conversation to be had around this and treating people as individuals and having a really careful response. And also the response to children and young people. We often mention we want to see children and young people as victims in their own right. We also want to see services and responses and support and belief in what they're going through, and making sure we can really go against the kind of the grain that we're seeing at the moment. So thank you very much. So Jade, obviously you do some incredible work at ACON, and we'll reference Jayke's story, and thank you again, Jayke, for sharing your story today with us. How commonly do you see stories like Jayke's, and what barriers exist for the LGBTQIA plus community?
Thanks, Delia, and thank you, Jayke, for your story. We do see a lot of misidentification within the LGBTQ plus community, and I sort of want to speak to it on two main points. So firstly, completely agree, obviously, domestic and family violence is gendered in nature, but for our community, we do see men as victims quite often, and that is mainly because men are also the perpetrators of violence within our community the most. But of course, in gay male relationships, then we've got men as victims, and unfortunately, biases are applied by some people to decide who is the predominant aggressor in that situation. So it might be whichever man is the biggest, like the tallest, the strongest looking, that person will be identified, or whichever one just appears more masculine. And that's a problem for misidentification in our community. And when we're looking at women, it's sort of that same energy where, for instance, my partner is quite masculine presenting, even though she goes by she, her. I'm non-binary, they, them, but I present more feminine. And we often say, if we were in an instance, we both know that it would most likely be her who would be identified as an aggressor, even though I'm much bigger than her, just because I appear feminine. So that's an issue there. And there's also the myths and stereotypes for women in women-loving women relationships, that there's like this lesbian utopia, or that the relationships are egalitarian in nature, and that if you do get into a domestic dispute, you can't actually inflict real harm on one another, and that can really act as a barrier for women coming forward. And for men, yeah, there's obviously not that many services that will take men as survivors, and we've got our beautiful, diverse trans community who have even more barriers to accessing help, and non-binary folk who just don't know where they fit in the landscape. And yeah, the other thing was about misidentification in regards to identity. So, for instance, on intake forms, it's mostly like prefix Miss, Mrs, Mr. There's no other options for non-binary folk. When you're asked about, like gender, it's usually male, female, other. Like, we don't want to tick another, like the other box. We're not other. And there's just a lot of, it all stems from the same drivers, right? So the drivers that affect women and drive violence against women are pretty much the same for LGBTQ plus folk. So we're really looking at those rigid gender norms and gender inequality. We just have that added layer of complexity of cis-normativity and heteronormativity that underpins a lot of the services and a lot of the research and the resources. And that is slowly starting to change, which is really fantastic to see. But yeah, I think there's definitely always work to be done in the intersections of people who are at a disadvantage, whether that be cold people, First Nations folk, LGBTQ plus people, people with a disability, older people as well, I feel like aren't taken as seriously as they should be. So yeah, I just think there's a lot of work to be done in the space, but it's really exciting to see some of the conversations that are being had, and at things like this forum. So thanks for having me.
Thanks so much, Jade. And I think I'd love for us to be sat here outside. We spoke earlier about the fact that we're very, very committed and passionate, but wouldn't it be great if we were speaking to people that maybe knew nothing about this? And that's where we need to be. And I know that there's so many people here that are passionate about prevention, and there's so much more to be done, but thank you very much. And I think it is exciting that we're having these conversations, and I do think we need to jump out of a lot of mainstream advocacy as well, and I know that we're certainly challenged as a peak around that, really looking at priority cohorts and just changing our conversation. So I think someone mentioned it earlier as well, it's really looking inwardly about what we can achieve and what we can do together, and certainly the commitments here. So thank you, Jade. So Tanya, I've seen your stats and I see the amount of cases you're dealing with day in, day out. You and your staff are often the first point of contact for women who have been misidentified, particularly if they've been clients of yours, as the person listed as in most need of protection in a previous police incident. Can you tell us about some of your clients who have been misidentified and why you think it's so pervasive?
Okay, so shout out to all my sister CAS workers that are here. I didn't realise we had so many. I want to just give you an overview of MacArthur WDVCAS is based at Campbelltown, covers Campbelltown, Camden and Picton LGAs. We are actually the winner chicken dinner with CRP referrals for the whole state, so we get the highest referrals. We also have the highest serious threat matters. So while I just made fun of something that's really serious, but what I want to say is that we embrace that we get 115 referrals a week on average from the police, because that means for us, the women in our area are calling police and engaging with services to some extent. And when we look at those sorts of stats in the media, no matter whether it's about DV incidents, AVOs, breaches and things like that, I'm really passionate about challenging that as a negative, because I do believe that that is actually a positive. It shows that we're doing the right thing as workers in the sector. To a level, police are doing the right thing as well, because they're acting on those incidents, and as service providers, particularly as a WDVCAS, we're engaging as much as we can with those clients. So for my CAS, we've identified for some time that we have a very diverse community. So I have focus workers, I have an Aboriginal, multicultural, LGBTIQ+, youth-focused, disability-focused and generalist. So the only one I'm missing is elder. If anyone wants to give me any funding, I'll be happy to take that. When I look at the court list, so Tuesday's our normal AVO list day, so thanks for inviting me. I didn't have to go to court today, thank God, because the court list this week was 109 pages, and that was just for today, and that's just DV matters and traffic matters. So when I had a look at the list that one of my staff had prepared, we set up a list of the clients that we have, the clients that we don't yet have, and then because I have a duty solicitor roster for our female defendants or private applicants, I have quite a lengthy list of women that we will call, or that I call at court, to get support from our duty solicitor if they choose to do that. So on the list, while it's 109 pages, it's probably the biggest list I've seen, plus last week was a public holiday. 17 of those were women who are female defendants. So my job is to call those women at court, ask them if they have legal support, also ask them if they want to access some free legal support, even if it's just legal advice. They can still choose to represent themselves if they want, but I do reinforce the importance of at least getting some legal advice, because sometimes they don't realise the enormity of actually consenting to an AVO and pleading guilty to an offence if they work in an area where they have to get a working with children check, or they have to get those sorts of things done, and they may not realise. And we do see trends from time to time of women who are teachers or who work in childcare, and we do have women that say, he knows that my job is a teacher, so he made these false allegations. We have women that are nurses or work in hospitals, and he'll ring them and say she's stealing the drugs or that she's doing these things, because he knows the process for that means that she has to be investigated. So while we look at the misidentification in terms of that with policing, I kind of want to look at it a little differently, because I feel that we have a whole lot of responsibility ourselves as service providers. And I'll talk from my service provider. So if I have a client that we speak to who is a female defendant at court and feels that there's been some misidentification from police, then our job as her advocate and her support is to go to the police and raise that as a concern. It doesn't mean we're going to solve it, but at the very least, we have that level of responsibility in terms of supporting our client in what she's saying has happened. And I guess with the Safer Pathway model, there's other options with that as well. We could put her on the safety action meeting and raise it collectively with the stakeholders. Again, it's not the answer to everything, but in our experience in our area, it is a very positive way to also raise concerns with police, and we have some really proactive police that come to our SAM meetings as well. The other option that we have is that we will get our duty solicitors to support with that. We will write support letters, and we kind of just, we're that advocacy support voice that that woman doesn't have at that time for herself. And quite often they will tell us that they did admit that they did things to the police. And quite often women will tell us, I actually rang the police first because I wanted them to make him leave. And then they got there and it had escalated and I'd clocked him and I told police that I did, and it kind of goes from there. So we do support with reps to police. We do raise it at that level. We do have... I think we have a proactive relationship with our police in our area. We have some crappy times sometimes, but I'll probably be the person that will highlight that to those people higher up in those commands, just because I'm a dinosaur and I've been around for so long, and they kind of probably expect it. But what I want to also put out there in terms of misidentification, and I'll be really quick, is we also need to look in our own backyards. So we need to look as a service provider how we actually view our clients. We need to look at whether we're looking at that client with that lens of, oh, she's a defendant at court, or there's an allegation against her, and we leave it at that. And I'm talking more away from DV service providers. I'm talking about support services like in the disability sector or multicultural sector, or services that don't provide DV-specific supports. What are you doing to talk to that client and establish what their actual space is? Are they actually the defendant? Are you asking the right questions? Are you asking them if they're safe? Are you doing a DVSAT? Are you doing a safety plan with them? Are you helping them with getting relocated? Are you talking to them about who they've got for support outside of the hours that you work as a service provider? So while 100% I agree with the misidentification theme, I would also want to challenge people to have a little look at the service they do provide and be really clear around how you're actually identifying your clients and what you're doing to make sure that you're not misidentifying them as well.
Thanks, Tanya. And I think there you've highlighted a few of us, I think probably all of us actually advocate around this, but the multidisciplinary work that needs to happen, it's just essential. And I think Padma mentioned earlier in her section that, you know, as a lawyer, she wasn't trained in domestic violence. Well, guess what? As a social worker, I opted for that module. It's not even in social work. So I think we really need to think about, as you said, all those external services outside of DV services that we can positively engage around this conversation and really think about responsibilities, trauma-informed work. So, and Tanya, I just want to also point out, which I really like, is the relationships you're building, dinosaur or not, which you're not. But I think it is about creating a network around you when you've got services. And I think a few people have mentioned that today, like really building trustful, positive relationships to get the results for your clients. So thank you very much. So Ulla, you've got a pretty big question, Ulla. So we'll go steady and slowly. Can I just get a check on time as well, just so that I... Okie dokes. All right, well, we'll do what we can, but we want to make sure we've got a good, robust answer from Ulla. So Ulla, particularly thinking of men's behavioural change programmes, how do you identify when a perpetrator attempts to have their partners misidentified throughout your ongoing engagement with them? Next part, which we can get to, but how do you engage in conversations exposing the abuse of power and control, and how do we interrupt some of those behaviours as a society as a whole? So firstly, how do you identify when a perpetrator attempts to have their partner misidentified through your engagement?
Thanks, Delia. Yes, they're a big question and very important areas, but what I'd like to start off with is thanking today's presenters and all the information that we've heard today and the discussions we've had today really also underpins the work that we do at No to Violence, and in particular in the men's behaviour change work in the sector, or more broadly in the sector of men's behaviour change. And the voices that we heard from strong women this morning and representing other women's voices, that is the underpinning of the work that we do in men's behaviour change as well. So across New South Wales in the men's behaviour change work, we've got 18 providers, and registered providers need to meet accreditation, and the very first principle of the practice standards for accreditation is maintaining or keeping women and children safe. So the voices that we heard this morning, I thank you for those voices. It informs the work that we do with men. So, a big question. So also in the context of men's behaviour change interventions, as I said, the core principle is keeping women and children safe. But how do we, in that work, and I also have facilitated groups for men, so I have that practice experience. So how do we identify when engaging with men, when men attempt to be misidentified or create a moment of misidentification? So it's about men excusing their use of violence. It's men blaming victim survivors, their partners. It's minimising their actions and behaviours. Sometimes it's about not identifying and being able to name their behaviours. And they're the areas, when you are a practitioner, working with men, to really listen to their worldviews. First of all, it is about that respectful engagement. It is about listening to men. Where does he come from? What is the story that he's carrying? What is his narrative? And picking up from those narratives, attitudes, beliefs, his worldview around himself, his family, his behaviours, and understanding and unpacking those and really creating those curious questions and conversations, inviting him into that space. He might have ruminating thoughts around his partner or the blame or the victim stance. And it's not a matter of, as a practitioner, when you're engaging directly with a man, either in individual sessions or through group work, it's not a matter of power over. It's providing him that invitation, that space to step into that change journey. It doesn't mean that that's change immediately straight away, but it's about planting those seeds and then respectfully challenging him on those attitudes, beliefs, where there might be an opportunity of blaming the partner. We talk about having a balance between compassion and collusion, and many of you might be very across or well aware of collusion and what that might mean. But it's really important in the work that we do with men when practitioners sit in that space and hear his story and respectfully challenge him, but not to step into the space of collusion. Even your own body language, when men might say, because if she did this, or if she hadn't have done that, I wouldn't have behaved in a certain way, and taking that victim stance. And even as a practitioner, if your body language is more, yeah, I understand where you're coming from, and being respectful and having smiles on your face, that gives, you're sending already messages to him. So that's where the misidentification can start happen in his mind, and he'll potentially, and I'm using gendered language here now, he might potentially even then groom you more into understanding from where he's coming from. So it's tricky spaces, and they're tactics that person using violence might use, but it is a matter of engaging in that conversation, but the practitioner also having skills and understanding of evidence-based research, as we talked about it today, always having a focus of victim-survivor safety and thinking about risk, still giving him the opportunity, but then unpacking those questions, holding him, or not, actually that's the wrong thing to say. And we hear a lot that we need to hold men to account. How we would like to rephrase it, and what I've learnt from practice is more of inviting him into the space for himself to hold himself to account. That's the best way to start that change journey. So yes, it is identifying areas where he minimises, justifies, excuses, and takes a victim stance.
Some really, really good insights there as well, Ulla, and I certainly think it's certainly for those of us working in services and responding to victim survivors to work really closely with organisations and collaborate, and yeah, so thank you. I think the body language piece is really interesting, because I guess it is tricky trying to navigate providing support and intervention but creating accountability. Thank you for that. So we've got one final question, and I'm going to just ask whoever wants to answer, there'll be maybe 2 answers that we can take, because I think we want to make sure we can wrap up and share a few solutions and some calls to action today. So the final question is, if everyone has an answer, then we'll definitely try and squeeze it in, but what are some of the solutions you see to the issue of misidentification? And how do we start addressing the issue from all of the different angles everyone on this panel works within? And just picking up on Maha's point, solutions, strength-based, kind of not coming out of here feeling like, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? So good luck everyone on this panel if you have the answer. Who would like to go first?
I don't have an answer, but I have an opinion, of course, everybody says. In terms of solution to the issue of misidentification, I think that we need to continue to work together. I think that we need to be collaborative in our service provision no matter where you work. I think that we need to challenge those people that maybe are working in their silos still, and I don't care who you are and where you work, we will challenge it. And I think that we need to ensure that the client that we have with us is always at the forefront, and that we also take stock of those biases that we might have, even if they're biases that we don't realise. So it's like taking stock of yourself and where you are in that space, and having good people around you that will pull you up if you do that stuff.
Solutions are really important, and I think it's important that we don't let perfect get in the way of good, and I think sometimes that's a real problem. However, I think there's a few different ways that we can approach solutions moving forward. I think first of all, it's about really being client-centred and making sure that we focus on women's agency and dignity, and that we understand that, you know, the issue of misidentification can really send women down a really slippery slope where it can reinforce trauma if we are not keeping their choice and their dignity in view, if we are not looking through the lens of resistance and what are their ways of resisting, and what is the deliberateness and the meaning that they put on their actions, so that we're not projecting our own assumptions or our own experiences about what's causing them harm or distress, or what safety looks like for them. So I think that's really important. Another piece of work that I'm really interested in is around building some of those diversionary and referral pathways as early on as possible. The fact is, we're talking very much about a criminal justice response because of the upcoming coercive control reforms as well. And the reality is 2 in 10 women don't report to police, and sometimes we hold disclosure as the beacon, and sometimes it's not for everybody. So I just think we just need to keep a really broad view on what that could look like for different people and for different communities, and make sure that the system is malleable enough to be effective for their outcomes when it intersects with housing and child protection and racial discrimination and all those things, because, you know, it can be very challenging. There's one particular case that comes to my mind where, you know, she was in a refuge setting, in our refuge, and she went to a park, and her child, one of 4 children who stayed with her, was taken from her at a park, and she was so distressed. And that response, you know, when the police turned up, it was, well, that's the father, he has every right to access his children. And what that triggered for her, and people around her said, you need to calm down, you're not doing yourself any favours, and they didn't mean that in a bad way, and they actually really helped her in that instance. And then what that meant like for her, when it meant, you know, her Centrelink payments were made to be look like as theft, and the car that she left in was made to be look like it was stolen property, and I'm just showing all of these things because it really is exacerbated, and it's really struggling. Even if she's been in the country, she was in the country for 20 years, yet barely spoke much English, because there was that element of, you know, dependence in that relationship. You know, and it was a long process. Now she's doing amazingly well. She's got contacts with her children again. But even the fear of when her children reached out to her, what did that mean? And she was really terrified. So I also think when we talk about misidentification and education and community awareness, I worry that sometimes that's only looked at through a lens of a communications campaign, what does real engagement and trust really look like? It takes long work. It takes transformative work. So, but it's not hard. It's actually simple. It comes down to interacting with agency and dignity and humanity. So that's another area I think we can easily do. And one more thing is around what, Tanya, you were saying, around looking internally. How do we keep a patterns-based approach when women seek support, not an incidents-based approach? How do we create that cultural shift within our own services and our frontline workers where we actually ask questions about the perpetrator's use of violence and keep them in view? And then at the same time, I just want to make one final point. And our sister earlier this morning, I think it was Gail who said this earlier, and it really speaks to what we see on the ground. We're working with multicultural communities. Sometimes we think it's just newly arrived communities. It's not. It's second, third, fourth generation communities where culture, family, expectations play a role. And what she said was around, and it triggered me in a positive way, was around, what she worries about for her son interacting with police. Women from migrant and refugee communities experience that too. They experience when children are in their care and they're escaping violence, and they're worried about that stigma of their experience falling onto their children and their sons. So just around like primary prevention, early intervention responses, what does that actually look like? Maybe just not at the peripherals of the criminal justice system, maybe at 1 or 2 steps earlier is where we also need to practically start looking.
I'd like to mention, and it was already mentioned today, just from the lens of working with men in that space and to avoid misidentification, it was mentioned of who is most fearful. So when we encounter men or we intervene, or and first of all to have the courage to intervene and stop and have those questions, and when you're assessing who is most fearful and who is exerting the greatest amount of power and control, and really thinking about that and thinking about the context, but also then thinking about what is the person using violence really capable of, how far he or she is ready to go. So really having an understanding of coercive control, yes, but the context, but as you said, client-centred, who is fearful in that situation.
If I may, I just want to add something to what you've both said. There's been a lot of discussion around the practitioner perspective and the role of police. And one thing I want to reiterate, and it was one of the sisters this morning on the panel with Gail was talking about, we Indigenous people, we're accountable to our communities, and we're very fearful of calling the police because more often than not, incarceration or even just being in police custody is considered a worse consequence than the original offence that led to the arrest in the first place. But, broader than that, and I guess a hyper-focus, is on what about the families? What about the children? I'm traumatised from my own personal experience. We don't talk about our trauma. Some of us come from very, very patriarchal families where therapy isn't encouraged, counselling isn't encouraged, support services because of shame. And we haven't talked about the shame. So there are a lot of layers to this story that I think we need to sort of keep in our periphery. They're just as important. I know we could, write book chapters on this stuff, and there's a lot to cover in one day, but I think it's really important that we think about how shame impacts on this. We think about siblings, families as an entire unit, and extended families and extended communities, especially if they're regional, remote. Everybody knows each other. It's not as simple as going to a metropolitan police station assuming no one will know you, no one will know about it, it's completely confidential. It's not in our communities, it's not. So I think, yeah.
Thanks, Amanda. I think that shame thing's a really important piece. I think when I started this morning, I said about, when you end up in a court system, and obviously not everyone does choose the criminal justice system, the shame and humiliation and the kind of, I'm not just going to fight this. And I think the family piece is really important, and we probably haven't had enough time to touch on that today. I think the children and young people and that wraparound support that is definitely needed to be considered. Another thing that's come up is the pressure we put on the protective parent. That's come up so much today, and then the kind of losing sight of the person using violence. Did anyone want to finally add, or I will just say a massive thank you. I think so much came out there actually that was unexpected, but important and significant conversation. So much to do, and just want to say a huge thank you to everyone for sharing their stories, their passion and their views and their experience. So thank you very much. Closing this panel.
Thank you.